The PS2 era delivered some of the greatest games ever made. From unforgettable adventures to groundbreaking action titles, these games helped define an entire generation of gaming. Here are some of the best PS2 games of all time. Persona 4 started with a simple murder mystery, but after a few hours, I got completely invested in the town, the characters, and the strange TV world. I liked how every dungeon reflected a character's fears and hidden side, which made the story feel much more personal than most RPGs I played on the PS2. The turn-based combat stayed fun because enemies could punish mistakes very quickly, so battles never felt mindless. I also spent a lot of time building social links and balancing school life with dungeon crawling, which gave the game a unique rhythm. Some dungeon layouts became repetitive later on, but the strong cast, music, and atmosphere kept me interested until the very end. Twisted Metal Black was much darker than I expected when I first played it, and that atmosphere stayed with me the entire time. I missed the goofy tone and heavy metal energy from the older games, but I still had a lot of fun because the vehicle combat was chaotic and addictive. Every match felt intense with missiles flying everywhere, destructible environments, and aggressive enemies constantly chasing me down. I liked experimenting with different vehicles since they all had unique weapons and playstyles, especially Sweet Tooth and Darkside. The boss fights were surprisingly tough and sometimes frustrating because the AI could feel unfair. Even with the gloomy story and repetitive enemy behavior, the fast gameplay and explosive battles kept me coming back for more. Rayman 2 Revolution gave me a platforming adventure that stayed creative almost the entire time I played it. I liked how the game kept introducing new ideas instead of repeating the same gameplay over and over. One moment I was carefully jumping across dangerous areas, and the next I was riding rockets, escaping enemies, or flying through huge levels using Rayman's helicopter hair. The colorful environments and strange characters gave the world a unique personality that stood out from other PS2 platformers. The music and weird voice style also made the atmosphere much more memorable. The camera sometimes became frustrating in smaller areas, and the hub worlds could slow things down a little, but the creativity and variety kept the adventure consistently fun. Burnout 3 Takedown turned racing into pure chaos with insane speed, aggressive driving, and huge crashes happening constantly. I spent most of my time boosting through heavy traffic, slamming opponents into barriers, and barely avoiding destruction while trying to stay in first place. The gameplay rewarded risky moves, which made races much more exciting than traditional racers, where careful driving matters more. Road Rage became the mode I returned to the most because launching rivals into traffic and watching the dramatic slow-motion wrecks stayed satisfying for hours. Crash Mode was also incredibly addictive since creating giant chain reactions and destroying entire intersections never lost its appeal. Some AI racers could become frustratingly aggressive, but that intensity made victories much more rewarding by the end. Sly 2 Band of Thieves mixed stealth, platforming, and humor in a way that made the adventure constantly entertaining. I liked how the missions rarely repeated the same ideas, so I was always doing something different, like sneaking across rooftops, spying on enemies, pickpocketing guards, or setting up huge heists with the gang. Playing as Sly, Bentley, and Murray added a lot of variety because each character handled situations differently and had their own useful abilities. The cartoon-style visuals and voice acting also gave the game a unique personality that stood out immediately. Combat was probably the weakest part since fights could become repetitive, but the creative mission design and fun character interactions made the whole experience much more memorable than I expected. Tekken Tag Tournament became one of the fighting games I played the most because the combat was easy to understand while still having plenty of depth. I liked experimenting with tag teams and finding character combinations that worked well together instead of relying on a single fighter. The battles looked smooth and fast, and many attacks had a strong impact that made fights satisfying to watch and play. The massive character roster also gave me plenty of reasons to try different movesets and strategies. Tekken Bowl was a surprisingly fun extra mode whenever I wanted a break from regular matches. The game did not add many new ideas compared to earlier entries, but the addictive gameplay and polished presentation made it difficult to stop playing for long. Beyond Good and Evil had a unique mix of stealth, exploration, and storytelling that made the adventure stand out quickly. I liked sneaking through restricted areas, taking photos of evidence, and uncovering secrets about the people supposedly protecting the planet. Jade was also a strong main character because she came across as calm, smart, and believable instead of overly dramatic. The gameplay stayed varied with stealth sections, hovercraft travel, puzzles, and light combat spread throughout the adventure. I also enjoyed how the story handled themes like propaganda and corruption without becoming too complicated or heavy-handed. Combat was probably the weakest part since enemies became too easy later on, but the memorable world, strong atmosphere, and creative ideas made the game hard to forget long after I finished it. Devil May Cry 3: Dante's Awakening had some of the toughest combat I experienced in an action game because fights demanded fast reactions, smart timing, and constant focus. I died many times against bosses, but the gameplay was so satisfying that I kept retrying battles with different weapons, styles, and strategies. I liked how Dante had multiple fighting styles that completely changed how encounters played, especially Trickster and Gunslinger. The combat also looked incredibly stylish, with wild sword combos, gunplay, and over-the-top action scenes happening non-stop. Dante's cocky personality became more entertaining as the story continued, even with some cheesy dialogue here and there. The visuals were not always consistent, but the addictive combat easily carried the entire adventure. Klonoa 2: Lunatea's Veil used colorful visuals and creative platforming to make the adventure enjoyable almost immediately. I liked using Klonoa's ring to grab enemies and turn them into double jumps, projectiles, or special abilities, because it added more variety than standard platformers usually offer. The 2.5D level design also looked great, especially with the shifting camera angles and smooth cartoon visuals that still hold up well. The surfing stages became some of my favorite parts since they were much faster and more chaotic than the regular platforming sections. The story tried a little too hard to become emotional at times, and the game was much shorter than I expected. Even so, the fun mechanics and charming presentation made it an easy game to enjoy. NBA Street Volume 2 turned basketball into pure style and chaos, with ridiculous dunks, flashy tricks, and non-stop momentum swings during matches. I liked how the game rewarded creativity because pulling off insane combos and humiliating defenders was just as important as scoring points. The controls were easy to learn, but there was still plenty of depth once I started chaining moves together and building huge game breakers. Be a Legend also gave me a reason to keep playing, since unlocking courts, players, and special moves stayed satisfying for a long time. The fast animations and exaggerated streetball atmosphere made matches much more exciting than traditional basketball games. Defense could become frustrating against skilled opponents, but the addictive gameplay made this difficult to stop playing. Kingdom Hearts 2 mixed Disney and Final Fantasy characters in a way that sounded strange at first, but the adventure became really entertaining once everything started coming together. I liked how fast and flashy the combat was because even simple attacks turned into huge aerial combos and stylish action scenes. The drive forms were also a major highlight since they changed how battles played and made difficult fights much more exciting. Exploring different Disney worlds added plenty of variety, even if some story sections dragged on longer than needed. The reaction commands during boss fights also made encounters more cinematic and satisfying. Some worlds felt too small and linear, but the fun combat, strong music, and emotional moments made the adventure easy to stay invested in. Guitar Hero 2 turned simple rhythm gameplay into something ridiculously addictive once I started learning harder songs and faster note patterns. I liked how satisfying it was to hit long note streaks, survive difficult solos, and improve my timing after repeated attempts. The guitar controller also added a lot to the experience because using it felt far more fun than pressing buttons on a regular controller. The co-op mode became the biggest highlight since playing lead and rhythm parts together created some chaotic and memorable sessions with friends. Watching both players struggle through difficult tracks also became hilarious at times. I did not recognize many songs compared to the first game, and some tracks were less memorable than expected, but the gameplay remained incredibly fun for long sessions. Red Faction became much more interesting once I realized I could destroy walls, create shortcuts, and completely change firefights with explosives. I liked experimenting with the Geo-mod system since it added freedom that most shooters at the time did not have. The campaign also stayed varied by constantly changing locations, throwing me into mines, laboratories, vehicle sections, and large battles without slowing the pacing too much. The weapons were fun to use, especially the railgun, because shooting enemies through walls felt ridiculous in the best way possible. Enemy soldiers could become annoying when they repeated the same voice lines non-stop, and the multiplayer lacked the intensity of the campaign. The destruction mechanics alone made this shooter far more memorable than many others I played around that era. Love Katamari mixed bizarre humor and simple gameplay in a way that became ridiculously addictive after only a few levels. I liked starting with tiny objects like pencils and snacks before eventually rolling up animals, cars, buildings, and entire sections of a city. The strange characters and colorful visuals gave the game a weird personality that stayed entertaining the whole time. Some missions also added fun variety, especially the snowball stages and the fireball challenges. The soundtrack matched the chaos perfectly with weird songs that somehow worked with the gameplay. Multiplayer was less enjoyable because it became frustrating to coordinate movement with another player, but the creativity and absurd atmosphere made this game unlike almost anything else I played during that era. Final Fantasy X became one of the most emotional RPGs I played because the story balanced huge world-saving stakes with personal struggles between the characters. I liked how each party member had distinct personalities and useful roles during combat, which made battles more strategic than many earlier RPGs I played. The turn-based system also stayed engaging because swapping characters during fights added much more flexibility against different enemies. The sphere grid looked confusing at first, but customizing stats and abilities eventually became really satisfying. The world of Spira also looked beautiful with impressive environments, music, and cinematic scenes that still hold up well. The fixed camera angles occasionally became annoying while exploring, but the story, combat, and memorable cast easily carried the adventure forward. Midnight Club 3 Dub Edition Remix delivered some of the fastest and most chaotic street races I experienced in an arcade racer. I liked speeding through crowded streets, discovering shortcuts, and weaving through heavy traffic while trying to stay ahead of aggressive opponents. The car customization was also a major highlight, since I could change almost everything from paint and rims to performance upgrades and hydraulics. The huge variety of cars and bikes gave me plenty of reasons to experiment with different builds and racing styles. Tokyo added more races and extra playtime, even if the city itself did not feel very unique compared to the others. Some events relied too much on memorizing shortcuts and trial and error, but the speed and customization kept the gameplay exciting for hours. Silent Hill 2 terrified me in ways most horror games never managed, because the fear came more from the atmosphere and psychological tension than constant action. I spent most of the game slowly walking through foggy streets and dark hallways, expecting something horrible to appear around every corner. The monsters were disturbing enough on their own, but the sound design and strange environments made everything much more unsettling. Pyramid Head especially stayed in my mind, because the game treated him like an unstoppable force instead of a normal enemy. I also liked how the story explored guilt, grief, and trauma without directly explaining every detail to the player. The combat was clunky and simple, but the oppressive atmosphere and disturbing symbolism made the experience unforgettable. Virtua Fighter 4 Evolution relied heavily on deep and technical combat instead of flashy story scenes or exaggerated characters. I liked how fights depended more on timing, positioning, and reading my opponent rather than memorizing giant combo strings. Learning a single fighter properly took a huge amount of practice, but finally understanding when to block, throw, or counterattack made victories much more satisfying. The animations also looked incredibly smooth because each martial arts style moved in a realistic and believable way during battles. The roster was not as visually exciting as other fighting games from that era, and newcomers could struggle with the steep learning curve at first. The depth of the combat system gave me plenty of reasons to continue improving after my first few matches. Tony Hawk's Underground added a full story mode that made the skating career much more personal than earlier games in the series. I liked creating my own skater and slowly building a reputation through competitions, crazy challenges, and bigger events across different cities. Being able to get off the skateboard also added more freedom while exploring levels and searching for hidden areas. The gameplay stayed fun because chaining huge combos and pulling off ridiculous tricks never got old. The soundtrack was another major highlight since the music matched the skate culture atmosphere perfectly. Some story missions became repetitive, and a few characters were honestly annoying, but the mix of customization, progression, and arcade-style skating made this one of the most memorable games in the series. Jak II changed the series in a much darker direction, and at first I honestly was not sure how to feel about it. The colorful platforming from the first game was replaced with guns, difficult missions, and a huge city that clearly took inspiration from open-world crime games. Once I adjusted to the changes, though, I started enjoying how much more intense and ambitious the adventure became. I liked exploring Haven City, hijacking hover vehicles, and slowly unlocking stronger weapons and abilities while the story became more serious. Some missions were brutally difficult and relied heavily on trial and error, especially during vehicle sections. Finishing those frustrating missions always felt rewarding afterward, and the combination of platforming, shooting, and exploration made the gameplay extremely addictive. Ratchet and Clank Up Your Arsenal improved almost everything I liked about the earlier games by adding bigger weapons, more action, and more variety during missions. I enjoyed switching between crazy weapons like rocket launchers, plasma whips, and little robot helpers because combat constantly stayed fun and chaotic. The platforming was also smoother, and the different mission types stopped the gameplay from becoming repetitive too quickly. Some of my favorite sections were the arena battles and the Captain Quark side missions because they completely changed the pacing. The humor and character interactions also stayed entertaining throughout the adventure. A few Clank sections slowed things down more than I wanted, but the creative weapons and strong mission variety made this one of my favorite games from that era. Psychonauts mixed platforming and comedy with some of the most creative level design I had seen in a game from that era. I liked how entering different characters' minds completely changed the atmosphere, gameplay ideas, and visual style depending on their personalities and mental problems. Some areas were funny and chaotic, while others became surprisingly dark and emotional once I learned more about the characters. The writing also stayed entertaining because the game constantly switched between goofy jokes and serious moments without ruining the tone. A few levels became frustrating because of awkward platforming sections and repetitive objectives, especially later in the game. The imagination behind the world, characters, and psychological themes made the adventure far more memorable than most platformers I played around that time. TimeSplitters 2 delivered fast arcade-style shooting with a huge amount of content that kept me playing for a long time. I liked how the missions jumped across different time periods because it constantly changed the weapons, environments, and objectives instead of repeating the same ideas. The campaign could become frustrating on higher difficulties, especially during longer missions with limited checkpoints, but finishing tough sections always felt rewarding afterward. Arcade League and Challenge Mode added even more variety with strange objectives, unlockable characters, and fun bonus content. The multiplayer was also one of the best parts since the game included bots, tons of customization options, and chaotic matches across creative maps. The story itself was forgettable, but the fast gameplay and endless amount of modes easily carried the experience. Metal Gear Solid 3 Snake Eater delivered one of the most satisfying stealth experiences I played because the jungle environments gave me many different ways to handle enemies and survive dangerous situations. I liked sneaking through tall grass, using camouflage to blend into different areas, and quietly taking down guards before alarms could spread. The boss fights were also much more creative than I expected, especially encounters against the End and the Fury, because they forced me to think differently instead of relying on simple combat. The survival mechanics added extra tension since I constantly had to manage injuries, stamina, and food during missions. Some menus slowed the pacing too much, but the stealth gameplay, memorable bosses, and Cold War setting made this game extremely hard to forget. Baldur's Gate Dark Alliance started strong with detailed environments, smooth controls, and satisfying hack-and-slash combat. I liked exploring dungeons, collecting stronger weapons, and cutting through groups of enemies while slowly upgrading my character's abilities. The visuals were also impressive for the time, especially the lighting, water effects, and atmospheric locations spread across the adventure. Some battles and loot upgrades stayed entertaining for a while, but the gameplay eventually became repetitive because many areas reused the same combat patterns and enemy encounters again and again. A few platforming sections were also frustrating since the jumping mechanics never felt precise enough for those challenges. The story itself was fairly generic, but the combat loop and polished presentation made the adventure enjoyable during longer sessions. Shadow of the Colossus delivered a very different kind of action-adventure because the entire journey revolved around hunting and defeating massive colossi across a lonely world. I liked how each battle worked almost like a puzzle, since figuring out how to climb onto these giant creatures was just as important as attacking them. The environments also looked beautiful and empty in a way that created a strange atmosphere while riding across the world on horseback. Some controls were definitely frustrating, especially during climbing sections where Wander could easily lose his grip and fall at the worst moments. The camera could also become awkward during larger fights. The emotional story, incredible scale of the colossi, and unforgettable soundtrack made the adventure much more powerful than I expected. Medal of Honor Frontline opened with one of the most intense war missions I experienced at the time, because the Normandy beach landing immediately threw me into chaos, explosions, and non-stop gunfire. I liked how cinematic the presentation was since the music, sound effects, and large battle sequences created a strong atmosphere during many missions. The weapons also sounded powerful, and the environments looked impressive across beaches, towns, bunkers, and military bases. Some missions later in the campaign became repetitive because they relied too much on basic objectives and scripted events instead of introducing new ideas. Enemy AI could also behave strangely during combat, which occasionally ruined the tension. The opening missions, presentation, and large-scale battles still made the campaign memorable years after I finished it. Tekken 5 brought back the fast and responsive gameplay that I loved from the older entries, while adding smoother visuals and more polished combat. I liked how easy it was to start pulling off combos, but there was still plenty of depth once I spent more time learning different fighters. The roster also had a great variety of characters, so switching between different fighting styles kept battles interesting. The stages looked much better too, especially with interactive floors, environmental effects, and detailed backgrounds during fights. The soundtrack added a lot of energy because the techno music matched the pace perfectly. Some characters were stronger than others, but the smooth controls, addictive combat, and extra content made this one of my favorite fighting games from that generation. Resident Evil 4 changed survival horror into a faster and more aggressive experience that constantly threw large groups of enemies at me instead of slow zombies. I liked how satisfying the combat was because careful shots to the head or legs could completely change chaotic encounters. The weapons also felt great to upgrade, especially once stronger shotguns, rifles, and magnums became available through the merchant. Enemies stayed dangerous throughout the adventure since they rushed, surrounded, and attacked much faster than older horror games. Some controls felt restrictive because Leon could not move while aiming, and the camera angle occasionally made crowded fights harder than necessary. The action, Atmosphere, enemy variety, and combat variety made this one of the most memorable horror games from that era. Hot Shots Golf 3 mixed arcade-style presentation with surprisingly deep golf mechanics that took me a while to properly understand. I liked unlocking stronger golfers, better clubs, and new courses because it always gave me something rewarding to work toward after tournaments. The actual golfing also stayed satisfying once I learned how wind, terrain, spin, and shot power affected the ball during matches. Early rounds could be frustrating since small mistakes easily ruined a good score, especially before unlocking stronger equipment. The colorful courses and relaxing atmosphere made practice sessions enjoyable even when I was losing badly. Some characters were more annoying than entertaining, but the addictive progression system and satisfying golf mechanics kept me returning for more tournaments and challenges. Amplitude used a creative rhythm system that made me feel like I was rebuilding songs piece by piece while jumping between music tracks. I liked how the gameplay mixed timing, fast reactions, and score chasing because keeping long combos alive became satisfying on harder difficulties. The soundtrack also had a strong variety of artists and genres, which kept songs from blending together during long sessions. Some tracks became extremely difficult once the speed increased, especially when large gaps between lanes suddenly broke my combo streaks. The colorful visual style also looked great without becoming distracting during intense sections. A few power-ups were less useful than others, but the gameplay and music mechanics made this rhythm game much more memorable than most others I played during that era. Ōkami combined Japanese mythology, exploration, and puzzle solving into an adventure that constantly looked and sounded beautiful. I liked using the celestial brush because drawing symbols to cut enemies, bloom trees, or solve puzzles made the gameplay feel creative almost everywhere I traveled. The world also rewarded exploration with hidden secrets, side activities, and characters needing help across different villages and regions. Some dungeons were especially memorable because they balanced humor, storytelling, and large boss fights really well. The game could become too easy at times, since many puzzles were solved through simple trial and error, and Isun talked far more than necessary during important moments. The art style, emotional story, and relaxing atmosphere made the adventure memorable long after I finished it. Half-Life stayed interesting because the adventure moved naturally from one disaster to another without constantly stopping for menus or loading screens. I liked how the game balanced quiet exploration, environmental puzzles, and chaotic shootouts while Gordon Freeman slowly fought his way through Black Mesa. The alien creatures also added a creepy atmosphere, especially head crabs since they could suddenly jump at me from almost anywhere. The shooting felt smooth for its time, and the fast movement made combat much more exciting than many older shooters I played. Some objectives became confusing because the game rarely explained where I needed to go next. The pacing, memorable environments, and constant sense of danger made this shooter easy to stay invested in until the end. SoulCalibur II delivered some of the smoothest and most satisfying weapon-based combat I played in a fighting game from that era. I liked how each fighter used different weapons and fighting styles because battles constantly changed depending on who I selected. Fast characters like Talim played nothing like heavier fighters using giant axes or long-range weapons. The movement system also added more strategy, since circling around opponents and avoiding attacks felt fluid during fights. Weapons Master Mode gave me plenty to do outside normal matches because unlocking new weapons and challenges stayed rewarding for a long time. Heihachi felt slightly out of place compared to the rest of the roster, but the combat depth, smooth animations, and amount of content made this fighter easy to revisit repeatedly. Dragon Quest VIII: Journey of the Cursed King offered a huge fantasy adventure with memorable characters, charming world design, and a classic turn-based combat system that stayed fun for many hours. I liked exploring towns, fighting strange monsters, and slowly uncovering the story behind the cursed king and princess during the journey. The cel-shaded art style also looked beautiful because it matched the lighthearted atmosphere and colorful monster designs perfectly. Battles became more strategic once I started properly using tension boosts and character abilities against stronger enemies. Some sections required grinding before major boss fights, especially later in the game when leveling became slower. The world, soundtrack, voice acting, and sense of adventure made this RPG very easy for me to stay invested in throughout the journey. Dark Cloud II improved many of the frustrating mechanics from the first game while adding a much bigger adventure filled with dungeon crawling, exploration, and town building. I liked switching between Max and Monica because their weapons and abilities made combat feel more varied during longer dungeons. The diorama system was also satisfying, since rebuilding towns and seeing future changes appear afterward gave me a strong reason to keep progressing. The cel-shaded visuals and music stayed impressive throughout the adventure, especially during major story moments and boss fights. Some dungeons eventually became repetitive because enemies reused similar attack patterns and designs for too long. The combat, town building, mini-games, and huge amount of content still made this RPG easy for me to spend dozens of hours playing. Prince of Persia: The Sands of Time combined platforming, puzzles, and acrobatic combat in a way that made movement fun throughout the adventure. I liked running across walls, swinging over traps, and chaining together jumps because the controls usually stayed smooth and responsive during difficult sections. The time powers also added a clever twist, since rewinding mistakes removed frustration after failed jumps or bad fights. Combat looked stylish too, especially once larger groups of enemies started surrounding me during battles. Some fights dragged on longer than necessary, and the camera occasionally became awkward in tighter areas. Farah's AI could also become annoying during certain sections. The movement system, time mechanics, and puzzle design made this action-adventure much more memorable than many others I played from that era. God of War II improved the original game by balancing brutal combat and puzzle solving much better throughout the entire adventure. I liked how Kratos constantly moved between huge battles, dangerous traps, and large environmental puzzles instead of repeating only one type of gameplay for too long. The boss fights were also far more memorable because many of them combined action and puzzle mechanics during massive cinematic encounters. The environments looked impressive as well, especially the giant statues, ruined temples, and mythological locations spread across the journey. Some quick-time events became excessive since the game constantly interrupted combat with button prompts during fights and cutscenes. The scale, combat variety, boss battles, and Greek mythology atmosphere made this action game much more exciting than the first adventure. Dead or Alive 2 Hardcore offered fast and flashy battles that were easy to enjoy before I fully understood the deeper mechanics. I liked how smooth the movement and animations looked because fights constantly stayed fluid during counters, throws, and juggling combos. The counter system also added extra tension since predicting attacks correctly could instantly shift momentum during matches. Tag battles were another highlight because switching fighters mid-combo created chaotic fights with friends. The stages also looked impressive with interactive danger zones and detailed environments during battles. Some fights encouraged too much button mashing, and the English voice acting sounded unintentionally funny most of the time. The fast combat, smooth visuals, and multiplayer chaos still made this fighter very entertaining during long sessions. SSX Tricky made arcade snowboarding feel fast, chaotic, and fun with huge jumps, crazy tricks, and non-stop speed across massive courses. I liked chaining together long trick combos because landing huge uber tricks while flying across the map always looked satisfying. The redesigned tracks also had hidden shortcuts, rails, and alternate paths that rewarded experimenting during races and show-off events. The soundtrack added a lot of energy too, especially when the music reacted to big moments during runs. Some controls could feel awkward while setting up jumps, since small movements occasionally sent me in the wrong direction. Split-screen mode also became messy because there was so much happening on screen. The speed, stylish presentation, and trick system made this one of the most entertaining sports games from that era. Guilty Gear X2 offered one of the wildest fighting game rosters I played because almost every character looked and fought differently from the others. I liked how fast the combat felt, since aggressive play, quick reactions, and long combo chains were rewarded during intense matches. The Roman cancel system also added a huge amount of depth because it allowed advanced players to extend combos and recover from risky attacks. The anime art style looked fantastic too, especially during flashy special moves and chaotic battles filled with effects. The rock and metal soundtrack matched the pace perfectly and gave fights more energy. Some mechanics were difficult to fully understand at first, but the combat depth, unique characters, and fast gameplay made this fighter addictive once I learned it properly. Ico created a quiet and emotional adventure that focused more on atmosphere, exploration, and puzzles than constant combat. I liked moving through the giant castle with Yorda because solving puzzles together and protecting her during dangerous moments created a strong connection between both characters. The castle itself also looked beautiful with its lighting, huge structures, and distant landscapes that constantly made the world feel mysterious. The climbing and platforming mechanics worked surprisingly well, especially during longer sections involving jumps and narrow pathways. Combat was definitely the weakest part since the shadow enemies became repetitive and fighting stayed very simple throughout the game. The atmosphere, puzzle design, animations, and emotional storytelling made this adventure far more memorable than many larger action games I played from that generation. Mega Man X7 tried moving the franchise into 3D but struggled with awkward camera angles, frustrating platforming, and messy combat design. I liked some of the new ideas, especially switching between characters during stages and using Zero's fast melee attacks against enemies. Axel's copy ability was also interesting, even though it never became as useful as I expected during missions. The cel-shaded visuals looked decent for the time, and a few level themes stayed memorable. Unfortunately, the controls and camera constantly made simple platforming sections harder than necessary, especially during 3D segments where enemies attacked from awkward angles. The repetitive voice lines and weak pacing also became annoying quickly. Despite a few decent ideas, this was one of the weaker action platformers from that era. Ace Combat 04 Shattered Skies offered fast and satisfying aerial combat while making missions feel larger and more intense than older entries I played. I liked how longer objectives forced me to think carefully about ammunition and attack routes during battles against enemy aircraft, tanks, and missile systems. The dogfights also stayed exciting because enemy pilots were aggressive enough to keep battles tense across large maps. Some missions completely changed halfway through, which made the campaign less predictable and much more engaging. Returning to base for reloading during longer operations also added extra strategy during difficult stages. A few missions dragged slightly because of their length, but the scale, mission variety, soundtrack, and rewarding air combat made this one of the most memorable flight games from that era. Viewtiful Joe combined stylish combat, platforming, and time-based powers into one of the most unique action games I played from that era. I liked switching between slow motion, fast movement, and zoom attacks because fights rewarded timing and creative combos instead of mindless button mashing. The hand-drawn visual style also looked fantastic, especially during chaotic battles filled with exaggerated effects and enemy attacks. Boss fights were intense too, since many of them required learning patterns and carefully using VFX powers at the right moments. Some difficulty spikes became frustrating, especially during long boss rush sections where mistakes were heavily punished. A few extra abilities also felt pointless compared to stronger combat options. The combat system, visuals, and fast-paced action made this platformer memorable years later. Gran Turismo 3 A-Spec offered a realistic driving experience that made upgrading cars and improving lap times addictive for me. I liked earning money through races, buying faster vehicles, and slowly tuning them into stronger machines for tougher events later in the game. The driving physics also felt satisfying because different cars handled corners, braking, and acceleration in different ways. Some tracks rewarded careful driving and strategy, while others focused more on pure speed during races. The visuals looked impressive for the time, especially the detailed car models and smooth racing animations during replays. Grinding for money could occasionally become repetitive because stronger cars were expensive to unlock. The progression system, realistic handling, and huge amount of content made this one of the racing games I played the most. Onimusha 3 Demon Siege improved the older games with better combat, stronger visuals, and a more interesting story involving time travel between feudal Japan and modern Paris. I liked switching between Samanosuke and Jak, because both characters used different weapons and fighting styles during battles against demons. Jak stood out thanks to his whip attacks and platforming sections that added more variety to exploration. The time travel mechanics were also clever, since solving puzzles in one era could directly affect locations in the other. Combat stayed satisfying because absorbing souls and landing critical strikes always felt rewarding during larger fights. Some enemy encounters became repetitive outside boss battles, but the action, visuals, soundtrack, and time travel mechanics made this one of the strongest action games on PS2. Call of Duty Finest Hour showed how brutal early console shooters could be, with difficult battles, aggressive enemies, and very unforgiving checkpoints across many missions. I liked the Russian campaign the most because the battles around Stalingrad created a desperate atmosphere that made every firefight feel dangerous. Some missions also changed gameplay in fun ways, especially the tank sections and large defensive battles against waves of enemies. The soundtrack and war-torn environments helped the campaign feel intense throughout most of the adventure. Unfortunately, the shooting mechanics felt clunky compared to later entries, and friendly AI soldiers were often more annoying than helpful during difficult encounters. The strong atmosphere, mission variety, and memorable war sequences still made this shooter interesting despite its frustrating gameplay problems. Bully offered a smaller open world packed with memorable school activities, strange characters, and surprisingly funny missions around Bulworth Academy. I liked attending classes, pulling pranks, and exploring the campus because the school setting felt different from most open-world games I played at the time. The voice acting also stayed excellent throughout the story and helped every click feel distinct during Jimmy's adventure. Some missions became frustrating because Jimmy's controls felt clunky during fights, biking, and platforming sections. The graphics definitely looked dated later on, but the detailed world and strong atmosphere still carried the experience. The school setting, humor, side activities, and memorable cast made this one of Rockstar's most unique games. Rumble Racing combined fast arcade racing with chaotic power-ups, huge shortcuts, and stunt mechanics that constantly made races unpredictable. I liked searching for hidden shortcuts and using weapons against opponents because races rarely felt controlled for very long. The stunt system was also satisfying since pulling off flips and tricks filled my boost meter and rewarded risky driving during jumps. Some AI racers became extremely aggressive on higher difficulties, especially when they started using shortcuts and power-ups perfectly during close races. The track design stayed fun throughout because most courses had multiple paths and interactive hazards to avoid. A few announcer lines became repetitive after long sessions, but the speed, chaotic races, and arcade gameplay made this one of the most entertaining racing games on PS2.